Hello, this is Alex. Thank you for visiting my channel. Today I have a special one for you that has been a long time coming. As some of my friends know, I'm an avid model collector. I prefer to collect aircraft models that have some significance to me, either a personal story or a representation of something. My model collection, save for perhaps one or two which may not be added for a very long time, is essentially complete. Anything else would be a bonus. I'm here to share with you this collection and tell you all about it. The first portion is just a montage, and you're welcome to stop when you see it in all the glory. If you are interested in learning why I have them, stick around for the second half as I talk about my pieces. And as a bonus, I will also showcase my collection of purchased and built sci-fi starships, which is how I really started collecting. A big shout out to my main suppliers, Avworld Canada and Threshold Aviation, both of which have helped me in my collection and also saved me some money on these purchases. If you are a pilot in need of supplies or a model collector, these two stores are not to be missed. Also of great value is Aviation Retail Direct in the United Kingdom. Their prices are great, they ship worldwide, and they have a great selection of far rarer models than I would have had locally. Links to all these guys in the description below. Let's get to it. All right, my first one here is fairly straightforward. These two EVA Air model 777s that you see are kind of not in my collection anymore, simply because I bought one on deal. The other one ended up coming later from eBay and was originally supposed to fly to Asia on EVA Air, which is why I got them. But because of COVID-19, I ended up rebooking with other airlines. Now here's the start of the main collection. So that EVA Air 777 got replaced with the Korean Air 777, with which I flew Seoul to Manila. And coming back from Manila, I flew that A330 Asiana Airlines. And while I was in the Philippines, a very good friend of mine, he's a training captain for Cebu Pacific, and that ATR over there is what he flies. Had the chance to fly on that bird with him, and we also flew one of their Airbuses coming back. And coming to Air Canada, it was in fact the airline that I flew between Toronto and Seoul round trip with. Obviously, it wasn't the 777 for me. It was actually a 787, which was a great experience. The other two are a bit of an interesting thing. I had initially thought that I had flown a DC-9 to Jamaica all those years ago, back in the early 90s, because I'd remembered engines being at the back of the plane. But after speaking to some industry professionals, we found out it wasn't going to be a DC-9, not at that range. It was most likely a 727 that I flew to Jamaica and back. So the DC-9 at that point ended up being part of adding that type to the main airliner collection, but I did end up flying a DC-9 with Northwest Airlines. So all these three models were covered, as well as the 777 having the flaps down. That's a rare thing, so I just had to have that new Air Canada colors with the flaps down. That was definitely a must in the collection. And here we have some classics and yet another case of mistaken identity. I do remember flying a very large jet to Miami once. I swear it was a 747, and for many years I thought it was a Canadian Airlines 747, hence that piece. But regardless, amazing piece to have in the set. Just like the previous one, talking to some professionals, I found out that if it was Canadian Airlines, it most likely would have been a DC-10 servicing Florida, or it would have been a Ward Air 747. So trying to go back, figuring things out, I thought that it was most likely a Ward Air 747 that would have serviced that route. And this one here is more of a fun addition to my collection, as well as fulfilling a model category. I used to have an L1011 from Worldways Canada, but that's since been replaced with something that you'll see up ahead. But me being an astronomy fan, having been to NASA, flying over the NASA shuttle landing facility, having an L1011 in my collection, plus one having to do with space and astronomy, and it being the last flying Air L1011 in the world right now, made this a very important piece to have in my collection. And an interesting note, this piece is ridiculously heavy, really, really, really heavy. It's the heaviest piece I've got. And on this one, how could I not? Buffalo Airways, they had TV show, they've had plane savers, everybody knows them and they can be recognized anywhere. So of course I had to have a Buffalo DC-3 in my collection. As far as the A310, I have been on an A310, an Air Transat A310. Unfortunately, the Transat A310 got released too late, but that allowed me to get this one in the 200 scale, which is our Prime Minister's plane. It's our personal own Air Force One, essentially. So, to be honest, I'm glad I have this. The Transat A310 I did end up getting in 1/400 scale. Now, this section you see here happens to be probably the single most important collection of aircraft that I've got in my collection. Canada 3000, back then known as Air 2000, and Worldways Canada were my very, very first airline flights when I was a kid, and I was absolutely terrified. These models replaced previous models representing these companies that I had. I had an old Air 2000 757, which I had since I was a kid, and it was all chewed up because of my teeth. So I finally got to replace it with something serious. And the Worldways Canada replaces that old L1011 plastic that I used to have. And as a side note, most of my plastic models have been replaced by Diecast. In the case of the Worldways Canada, it was actually a DC-8 that I flew, not a 707, hence the DC-8 represented there, but Canadian Pacific, which also happens to be the airline that my mum flew after she first moved to Canada. And the Canada 3000, or rather Air 2000 at the time, was actually a 757 that I flew, hence the Iceland Air 757, which I had picked to fill in a 757 gap in my collection, but also because it looked good. Had Canada 3000 been available in 757, it would have been one piece right there, but such is as it is. And this pairing here is kind of interesting. The Air Canada 767-200 is the Gimli Glider, which I bought on half price. Nice addition to my collection. And I've got a Malev 737. Right after college graduation, my family down in Florida, they paid for a trip for me to visit my mom's homeland of Macedonia, and I flew Malev Airlines 767 between Toronto and Budapest and back, 737-500 to Skopje, and in Fokker 70 coming back. And coming back on that Fokker 70 was the first and only time I've ever cried on an airplane. The reasons are completely and utterly top secret. You will not find out why. That being said, many years I've been waiting for a Malev model to finally come out in plastic or diecast, didn't matter, but finally one came out and I had to jump on it. The Fokker 70 didn't get announced until after I bought this one, so I ended up buying a Fokker 100 in another model, which you'll see later. I could always go back and swap them when the Fokker 70 gets released, but I'm fine with having this Malev 737, even though the Fokker 70 would be the more appropriate piece to add. Now, these two are pretty straightforward. These guys represent my first time on an A320, my first time on a DC-9, my first time flying to the U.S. from U.S. Essentially, the A320 took me from Buffalo to Detroit. The DC-9 took me Detroit back to Buffalo, and between Detroit and Florida, I was flying on their 757. The DC-9 was also the first time I had experienced a powered pushback. These guys put the plane into reverse thrust right from the gate and push themselves back. No tow truck required for that. So that was a really unique experience. And there was a delay leaving Detroit Airport, which, by the way, is a really cool airport, to be honest. We got delayed because the captain joked that we needed to empty out our lavatories and that we would need them because they were serving tacos on board. Funny guy. Now, this one is more of a representative collection. As soon as I saw that yacht DC-10 on Aviation Retail Direct, I just had to buy it. DC-10 was a great fit for my collection, plus it also represented my mom and dad's heritage, Yugoslav Airlines. Well, back when it was called Yugoslavia, of course. And as far as the MD-11, that's also generally a good diecast fit for my collection. It was intended to replace a World Air Cargo MD-11 I had in plastic, but that plastic one actually is one of the rare plastic models that actually does look good, so I elected to hold on to it anyway. But the one with the panda face on it had to be. It just had to be. And here's another couple with an interesting story. The American Airlines 767 took me on my shortest ever flight on, surprisingly, a wide-body aircraft. It took me from Orlando to Miami when I was traveling for my cousin's wedding, which was in Disney, a big fairy tale wedding, which was the most magical and amazing thing ever. So that was kind of a historic flight for me. As far as the Lord of the Rings 767 there. That was one of the earliest diecast models I got, and it was also in the year 2018 which was my first year driving for the Toronto International Film Festival. And on the plane is a picture of Viggo Mortensen, which I happened to come very close to and watch autograph signing with him at my very first major TIFF experience. So that was kind of a special story on that one, and which is why I got that plane. Now, a couple years ago, I flew United Airlines to Florida yet again. Toronto to Chicago O'Hare, I actually flew in Embraer 145. It was impossible to find a United Express EMB 145, so I had to settle for buying this British Airways EMB 145 with a nice tail and the United Airlines 737 MAX. In fact, the real airplane I flew on was an 800, but the MAX was what was available, and also flew a United A320. That trip was unbelievably unique because I surprised my cousin. We rented an airplane and got to fly over NASA and flew over the shuttle landing facility. And it was the same time where that Southwest Airlines blew an engine and put a hole in the side of the plane where the woman lost her life. And it also happened to be the anniversary of the Apollo 11 disaster on that very same day. I could go on with more stories about that trip, but that would make this video even longer. There's a few tidbits for you. Now here we have Delta Airlines, which represented my first time flying to the US by myself. Back in the early 2000s, my mom and I went to Delta Connection Academy during the time I was researching professional commercial pilot programs. And we flew a CRJ between Cincinnati and Toronto and flew an MD-88, even though this one's an MD-90, between Cincinnati and Orlando Airport. And that was my first time aboard an MD-80 or Mad Dog Series, which was one of my coolest experiences. Got to sit up front and see how quiet it really is. So that was a fascinating trip. And the CRJ also replaces an old plastic CRJ I once had before. Now this one's going to be short and sweet. Porter Dash 8 Q400. First time flying with Porter and on a Dash 8. Flew to Chicago Midway during my very first trip to Oshkosh. It was Oshkosh 2017. It was also the first year I ever lived on my own, with my first place on my own, and right after my mom died. Also, Porter represents a friend of mine, Nazar, who now flies for Transat, but he was the one who introduced me to flight simulation and got me into aviation, got me learning about it, and inspired me to get my private pilot license. So that's a really great piece. I never had one of these in diecast. This one is plastic. Recently I found one very, very small one, like we're talking 1/400 scale diecast, which I ended up getting, but my collection is primarily 200 scale. So if one ever comes out in 200 scale, I'll be snatching that one up for sure. And here's a nice pairing. Just like in the previous slide, I mentioned my friend Nazar. Well, he now flies for Air Transat. But also the other significance of Transat is I also, back in 2010, flew Transat with two of my closest friends at the time. We went to Amsterdam and Paris. So on the way to Amsterdam, we flew aboard the A330. On the way back, I ended up flying by myself home, and it was my first and now going to be my only ever flight on an A310. Both of them fairly straightforward, benign experiences, but the trip itself was outstanding. In case you're wondering, between Amsterdam and Paris, I took the high-speed bullet train. And this is a Canadian Fokker 100. Besides it being a nice piece representing a defunct airline, I bought the Fokker 100 because it originally was supposed to represent the Fokker I flew on with Malev Airlines. Now this collection here was more for the sake of filling in the Airbus line of aircraft in my fleet. Never been on an A350, A340, A380, or C-Series slash A220. The A350 was my first A350 model, which I loved the design of, but it was also the very first model that I saw with flaps down. So for me at the time, having the flaps down was special. Even the elevator, rudder, they move, you could position them as well. The A340 on the Virgin just has absolutely beautiful colors to it. They're pearlescent red. A380 I got in 400 scale simply because the 200 scale would be way too big, way too expensive. And that kind of represents the A380, first and only A380 we have flying into Toronto. And then I had to get the Bombardier Cseries, which represents an aircraft that was built in Canada by Canadians for Canadians before Airbus took it over and renamed it. So that was an apt piece to have in my collection. And in here, the 400 scale Air Canada A340 is largely meaningless. The only reason I have that one was because I had that in a larger scale plastic, and I simply wanted something from Air Canada in their previous paint job. So I settled for a cheap 400 scale one from the trade show that was on sale. And then the Aeroflot A320 was a clearance piece I picked up, which happened to have nice colors. That was very, very early on in my diecast collecting. So again, that's just a piece to help fill in. Well, it doesn't even really fill in a gap anymore, but it's just a nice one. That's all. And this piece here is probably one of the most important pieces in my collection next to Worldways and Canada 3000 is a 747-200 stretched upper deck. The actual one I was on was a 747-300, but for all intents and purposes, with considering only minor internal differences and maybe engine options, they're really the same thing, essentially. In 2000, I was graduating from an art school as part of a symphony orchestra. And it was my first trip to Europe with this symphony orchestra. Also, first trip traveling alone without my parents. So it was a wonderful experience. We went to Amsterdam, then flew a 737-400 to Vienna, made a side trip to Budapest and back, and it was an excellent trip. This one, unfortunately, came damaged. I had it shipped overseas, and I sent a claim to the vendor, and unfortunately, it was the last of its kind. The vendor was kind enough to leave it with me and not charge me for the aircraft. Though looking at the receipt initially, they said they were going to give me a refund, but they never even charged me on my account to begin with. They charged somebody else. So kind of a funny story with that one. Anyway, a nice $200 model for no charge. I'm sick of 787s. I'm sorry, did I say that? Crap. Having all these 787s was just a fluke. Originally, I had wanted that Etihad Formula One 787 for my collection. That Etihad Formula One represents my best friend Oleg, who is a massive Formula One fan, and I had lost hope in that one ever showing up, but I held off. Then I ended up getting the 1/400 scale LOT Polish Airlines special livery, which represents another very close friend of mine, Tom. And that was the first 787 in my collection. The KLM 787-10 didn't initially want it because, again, I had a 787 in my collection and I didn't really want another one, but I couldn't resist not having a KLM 100th anniversary plane in my collection. And the way that 100th anniversary is painted is a hell of a lot nicer than it actually is on the 747. So that one stuck. And then the Qantas Aircraft is another piece that I just had to have because it's also a 100-year anniversary for Qantas. That was the aircraft that made a world record-breaking flight between London and Sydney, and it was documented online by Sam Chui, which is a fantastic YouTuber. I strongly recommend you visit his channel. That's Sam Chui. And It also was a study aircraft to study the effects of long-term travel, what they can do for passengers, how much load they can load on an aircraft to get passengers comfortable and to survive such a long journey of that type. And the research was very successful. Now, before COVID, ultimately, I believe British Qantas decided to go for the A350, if I'm not mistaken, but don't quote me on that one. Regardless, a great, great story to go with that airplane, and that's got a very good reason to be in my collection, even if it is redundant in model type. And this A350 1000 Etihad, not much to it. Originally wanted an Etihad Gold because it was a nice paint job. But I mostly bought it because, well, I can't have all these 787s and no A350s to match it up, especially when I like the A350 better. So gold, long, beautiful. That's all it is. Now these F-18s are really special. The F-18 NORAD 60. I love the colors of it. Blue is a wonderful color, and you couldn't have gotten a better paint job on one of my favorite fighter jets. So when I saw that, I knew I had to get it. And then you got the F-18 Super Hornet there. That was gifted to me by my friend and coworker Bob. He knew how much I loved them. He hates Hornets, I think, but which is kind of okay with me. And he also gave it to me as a gift when I was feeling sad after I lost my mom. So that was very nice of him. And this guy here is a real nice piece, P-47. I used to fly it in my old combat flight simulators and all that stuff, but I found this piece at flea market / garage sale out in some countryside of southern Ontario. Packaging looked horrible, but the product inside was beautiful. And this is one of the original 757s I had in my collection from a long time ago, another plastic piece. British Airways, wonderful airline, and the Russian tail that's painted on these themed aircraft, much like that Embraer 145 we saw earlier, was just a fantastic piece to have. This is not a plastic model I care to get rid of. Now this one, Turkish Airlines, is one of the earliest diecast models I picked up. This was another one of those sale pieces I had before I ever owned any 777s. I picked this one up, again, to fill in a 777, but because the paint job is really quite nice on it. It's got some great graphics. Now, since I've already picked up other 777s, I thought maybe I should get rid of this one, but it looks pretty enough that I didn't have the heart to get rid of it, so I decided to hold on to it just because it is that nice. And this one here is just a leftover from back in the old days when I didn't have a 707. I had a coworker and a friend that was from Australia, so this was kind of for him, but not a model that particularly matters to me anymore. I've already got a diecast 707 and a Qantas, so this one I'll probably at some point sell off. The only thing I'm keeping it for might be the paint job. Now this one is another special pairing to 747-400s. The Air France in the background is a plastic model with clear cockpit windows. Another one of these special models that are worth keeping. And my mom grew up in France. Air France was one of her favorite airlines, so that's kind of representative of my mom. That's why that's still around. As far as the British Airways is concerned, there's another aircraft in my collection celebrating 100 years. That's 4 airlines celebrating 100 years, and it's a special Landor livery, which is my absolute favorite. I had a previous KLM 747-400, which was really well painted, but I didn't want too many 747s in my fleet. Too much is too much, you know, so I sold that KLM at a really great price, and I bought this BA Landor in its place and have no regrets. One of my favorite pieces. And this is the World Air Cargo MD-11 I mentioned earlier. Another plastic model I just about gave up when I decided the detail on it was really good, and I wish I had this one in diecast as well, but I didn't have the heart to get rid of it. It's kind of also down the line with One of the models that I am missing in my collection would be a UPS jet. It would be a UPS 757 ideally, but that's one of the pieces missing. My cousin works for UPS, flies between Atlanta and Toronto regularly for work, so it would be nice to have a jet that represents one of my family's company locations as well. A Westjet 737 plastic, got to represent, right? This I got a few years back before I started collecting diecast. Obviously, I'd like to have that in diecast and it's available, but I decided against it because I've got already a Max 8 in that United Airlines library. One day I may change my mind, especially if they come up with a WestJet Q400, but for now I'm sticking with this one. I've always wanted a business jet in my collection, and this was my first. When you have a $400 wood model that sells for 40 bucks because there's some damage that nobody can even find on it, it's a no-brainer. Thank you, Aviation Collector Show. You brought this to my collection. It also represents the type of aviation I prefer in my flight simulator, general aviation, but also as an up-and-coming commercial pilot, I would rather be part of business aviation than airline, personally. So it's something I aspire to fly. And this is one of my very old models that I almost got rid of, but it's glued together. It's got a missing landing gear assembly, so it's not exactly worth much, but it is a special Air Canada Canadian Airlines merger livery, which was around for a very short time, so you won't find anything with this paint job on it. That's kind of why I'm still keeping it, but I am sick of 767s. And even though it's not related to aviation, that Lego model in the background, that spaceship, literally was the very first model of anything I had from when I was a kid, and I assembled and disassembled that ship many times. So good memories with that one. That's another piece that will never leave. And last but not least, the Venerable Cessna 172. For those of you that don't already know, I am a private pilot, and I earned my private pilot license back in 2008. I initially started flying the DA-20 before it was sold, transitioned to Cessnas, flew those for a few years, and then after some time away last year, I renewed my private pilot license in a Diamond DA-40, got my night rating, and plan on continuing my training. Obviously, nobody makes little die-cast or plastic, affordable plastic models of Diamond aircraft, so I just got to settle for the Cessna. And that pretty much covers it. Thank you all so much for joining me on this journey. I know the video went a little bit longer than I had expected, but at least the beginning of it, for those 90% that would leave after that, they got the gist of it. And I'm glad you stuck around to learn a bit more about why I collect and why I choose what I choose. In this last section, we just have my collection of Starships, which I either hand-built or built from Eagle Moss. It was my goal for many years to collect at least one model of every major USS Enterprise on screen, as well as a few of my favorite sci-fi models. So I've got all the Enterprises now, from the NX-01 right to the Enterprise E, eventually the F, if I can ever find one from Eagle Moss, and also I have the Normandy from Mass Effect, and I've got Battlestar Galactica represented there as well. And that J.J. Abrams USS Vengeance, that was just one of those Hallmark Christmas ornaments, which I happened to get. I hate the ship, but it's still something. Thanks again for joining me, and have a great day.